Okay, so we have the second full-length album from Norwegian thrash metal band Vorbid. They're definitely a progressive thrash metal band, and A Swan by the Edge of Mandala is arguably their sort of full turn into um, progressive metal. And it's not as if they left thrash metal behind here. It's more that they've stepped fully into prog metal otherwise, and actually progressive rock influences as well. It's not really just the usual take on progressive thrash metal, which is fine with me. But this band, they started out getting compared to Vector quite a bit, as most harsh vocal technical thrash metal bands do these days. And I think with some of that was warranted. Their rhythms were more influenced by Megadeth than Vector was. Less touches of death metal and that sort of thing influencing the hyperspeed rhythms of that group. I heard a bit of Forbidden in that first EP and album. The first album definitely took a couple of interesting risks. Like I think it was like 26-minute song was the entirety of side B, and um, it was very successful in a lot of ways, but it was also a little bit grating, I think, because uh, as much as I appreciate the vocals and it was a very good performance, I think that they just needed to vary it up. And so that's kind of what they do on this album. It's very much what they do on this album. If it's the same vocalist, and it appears to be, yeah, hats off to him for just having this amazing singing voice, which is all over this record. And a clean singing voice is what I mean. Uh, so they, I think it's really interesting that they kind of just name a mid 70s Genesis album, uh, Metropolis Part 2 from Dream Theater, and some Steven Wilson album as their main influences for this concept album. An album which is clearly spawned by the pandemic and the sort of solitude of it, but also a very specific fear of becoming catatonic, of not being able to communicate with reality, with people. And I think it was a really interesting choice. I think it's a hard thing to communicate, and what better way to get across like a complex, personal sort of body horror than a progressive metal album, which caps off at around an hour. I think they really picked a lot of things fell into place with this record. You can tell. Um, they got their session bassist for this album is the fellow from Blood Red Throne, which is kind of a surprise. It's a pretty well impressive session, and their producer has produced groups like Communic, Reincarnation, and nothing really in the thrash metal realm so similar, but definitely gave them a progressive, modern metal sort of sound on this record. And they haven't stopped sounding like a group that kind of spawned from like the Vector craze in the early 2010s. But definitely they've differentiated themselves with this record, and that sound helps quite a bit. Um, there was a couple points on this record where I felt like I had sort of slid into a wobbler album. Not so much that it sounds like Yes, but that it sounds like Norwegian progressive rock or progressive metal, as you would. So, you can see I mentioned Leprous, Psychotic Waltz, Wobbler, like uh, things that I think you'd have to be more progressive metal fan to like understand how that it could apply to more aggressive thrash metal. And it's because it is more so a progressive metal record. So subgenre tags aside, I think this album is, I think it could really entertain someone who really cares about the history of progressive and technical thrash metal. I think it's a very impressive entry into that format and form and history. Uh, in terms of where it stands with progressive metal, we don't have a ton of really good, viable thrash metal rhythm guitarists contributing to that anymore. Not really in progressive metal and in terms of thrash metal. Definitely death metal has picked up that torch, but uh, it ends up being a very modern, but not cheaply cranked out album. You can tell that they sat down and made sure every second of this hour-long album with like 12-minute songs on it uh, matters, and what they're saying matters, I think they've even suggested that they wrote the lyrics along with the music so that uh, it would sort of uh, work together in tandem, but also sort of invoke more out of each side of it. So I think they've done some really fine work here. Like I feel like my score is just too low at this point, even. So this one has appreciated with me a great deal, even if I'm not really a fan of the sort of standardized feeling of a lot of progressive metal, and especially when it comes to very clean production values. I think it helps that Vorbid had those rough edges to sort of flesh out the album, and sort of getting that perfectionist sheen can't really take away their inherent personality, which comes from a love for classic thrash metal. So ultimately, I was just very impressed by this record. I think in terms of thrash that's interesting at all this year, there's very few competitors that aren't just doing the standard bullshit. And yeah, this is a group that just, I think, really just takes a leap. They take a leap and a bound with this record, and that's what I like to see. I think it's the most exciting thing is to see a record who that comes from a band who didn't really seem to have that much potential, or they did, but it felt like it was going to take many more records to get to this point. So I was just impressed that they got here and right away. And well, it took a few years, but um, yeah, it's I think one of the better records out in October. I think that if you have an interest in progressive metal, it's an absolutely give it a try. I think if you're a fan of thrash, you might have to be a little more broad-minded and not look for the purely classicist shit, you know. So yeah, see if you like it. Check it out. Read the review if you want a bit more detail. So that's all.